Hey, how are you? I am Super Dude, and today I'm going to talk at length about the two great pillars of game design, the gameplay itself and the storytelling. Oftentimes we treat these two as completely unrelated aspects of the gameplay experience, and I am no exception. I am very guilty of talking about the gameplay and acting like the story is just some accidental secondary thing. And there is some level of truth to that. As the saying goes, gameplay is king, and a lot of game devs take that to heart, with the story being much lower on their priority list behind that ever so crucial game feel. I've said before that games don't have to be fun, but that's because I'm an art fart. Your story can be the most beautiful and thought-provoking experience ever put to console, but if your game is boring to play, if it doesn't engage the audience, it won't sell as well as a similarly great story in a game that is engaging. It is helpful to be both. But despite the very real divide between these two concepts, with multiple examples of games that lean heavily on one pillar over the other, they're not actually separate at all. The shape of the story is deeply affected by the shape of the game, and I'm not just talking about genre. For a perfect example of this, look no further than the Fallout series. Raise your hand if you heard this one before. Fallout 4 is a good game, it's just not a good Fallout game. A large contingent of Fallout fans are in agreement that there's something fundamentally different about F4 compared to its priors, something that makes it bad at being a Fallout game. And there are a lot of potential culprits. The greatly expanded crafting system, which gives you a real reason to interface with the junk lying about the game, whether building settlements or tweaking your guns and armor, changing your relationship with the world now that literally any object has crafting value. The pigeonholed backstory of a cryogenically frozen pre-war widow whose child was stolen from them, forcing you to either contend with the very specific backstory you were given, or ignore it entirely, which Fallout 3 does something similar, but even that game wasn't as restrictive as 4. The streamlined dialogue system reduces your possible roleplay options so significantly that all choices water down to moving on the plot, so your roleplay doesn't have any mechanical bearing on the game. Which do you think makes this game less Fallout? Fallout 4 released in 2015, and some of the biggest open-world action RPGs of the previous few years had been Dragon Age Inquisition in 2013, and Witcher 3 earlier in the same year as Fallout, as well as a couple other AAA examples. And a lot of these games had voiced protagonists. Bethesda decided, whether of their own accord or administrative pressure, to give their protagonist a voice. And this single decision had massive ramifications on how the narrative could be structured. In Fallouts before or since, you could have as many as 8 different dialogue options, some skill-based, some attribute-based, which could lead the mission down different paths at different conclusions, each dialogue line bringing about a different response or two from the NPC before getting back to the main thrust of the conversation. Compared to voice dialogue, text is very cheap, so writers can create all sorts of fun and dynamic dialogue for your protagonist to spout and let the world respond to this exceptional individual. But in Fallout 4, every line you click is voiced, each line requiring the time and effort of not just the writer, but 2 voice actors to speak it into the world. With each decision tree having 4 voiced options, but actually 8 because you could be either sex, that means that your sole survivor takes up around half the vocal budget in every conversation where they used to take up none. Expand that logic across the entire game, and this is why Fallout 4 is so experientially different. With this voiced protagonist taking up so much vocal space, how expensive does that make tangents or side objectives? Do we really want branching paths when your character has 4, technically 8 lines of voice dialogue per decision path? Dialogue breaks down to yes, sarcastic yes, no, meaning yes later, because there's a lot more expense per dialogue decision compared to previous games. And because of that, the game's quest lines are pretty linear. You only really have 1 or 2 decisions per faction in Fallout 4, and of course choice of faction, but the game rarely allows you the luxury of choice. Fallout 4 is a really cool game, but the roleplay part of what is ostensibly a role-playing game is lacking because it's expensive to let this fucker talk. This is what the first part of this statement is pointing towards. This is a wildly different type of game now, but it's not a bad one. It's not Fallout. By the way, for the sake of transparency, you must know that I did not come up with this observation myself. I first heard this concept of Fallout 4's narrative failure from Xalavier Nelson Jr. during a fireside chat he did with Remap Radio on the topic of narrative design, which is his job, and what this video is about. Everything we've just gone over with Fallout is a consequence of narrative design, or how game design considerations inform the story you want to tell. Narrative design isn't the story itself, it's not the writing and plot, it's how the game design and structure communicates the story to the player. Like I said at the front, we often conceptualize story and gameplay as separate, but narrative design bridges that gap. For a bite-sized example, rogue-style games are modular by nature. You go into a gameplay arena to try and win the game, whether that means defeating the boss of the dungeon, escaping the underworld by kicking your dad's ass, or defeating your mom, Satan, yourself, the sacrificial lamb, Megas. For a game with such a repetitive gameplay loop, It makes sense that the story would be revealed in bits and pieces from run to run. They wouldn't want to put you through some linear narrative that interrupts your gameplay every 5 minutes. Lots of great examples of this done right. Hades is great. Jacob Geller did a whole video about Returnal, which is one of the few rare AAA roguelites. But The Binding of Isaac in particular is interesting here, since the game has been released and re-released so many times with the meaning of Isaac changing every time that you can see how Edmund's relationship to God and trauma has shifted over his life, until the final version of The Binding of Isaac, which we have now, changes the meaning so powerfully that it's honestly really beautiful, especially if you've been a fan all these years. Genre and structure matter a lot to telling the right story, and that's what I'd like to explore here today, with Nintendo's last console, the Switch. We still haven't had an announcement. I really thought we were going to get one by now. I wrote it and I was like, we're totally going to get an announcement, right? At the start of the Switch's lifespan, Nintendo released this niche open world adventure game called The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Maybe you heard of it? Immediately capturing the hearts of Nintendo fans and inspiring many other open world games to try a more sightline based approach to their open worlds. And Pokemon followed suit with an experimental open world bug catching RPG and folded it back into the mainline games with Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, which I just got for my birthday recently. Yes, I'm turning my fun into content, but I found myself captivated by how much Pokemon and Zelda had to change for their new open-world designs. So, let's talk about it. How did the narrative design of some of Nintendo's flagship games change to accommodate their new open worlds? Pokemon's story structure has stayed exceptionally consistent throughout its past 28 years, at least in the mainline games. Sorry to disappoint, but I'm not going to talk about every Pokemon game. That sounds like the premise for an Unraveled episode. Through all 9 generations, Pokemon has been the story of a child going on an adventure with their pocket monsters, defeating the gyms, or their equivalent, and eventually taking on the Pokemon champion to become the greatest Pokemon trainer in the region. Along the way, you will meet some hooligans belonging to this region's gang, performing the various deeds that you must stop, both because it's the right thing to do, and also because the story demands it. Originally, Pokemon games would only do light crime, like stealing or murder. Yes, if you forgot, Team Rocket did do that to a Pokemon. Murder is a thing in the very first Pokemon game. But further generations, gangs would get far more ambitious, with career ambitions such as literally just fascism, using kaiju to jumpstart climate change and devastate the environment, but in the direction that you want it to be devastated? Or if you think that's quaint, rewrite the whole universe in your image. I do not claim him! Throughout each game, you ping-pong between your ultimate goal, the Pokemon League, and the actual story of the game as represented by your struggle against this gen's team, culminating somewhere around the 7th or 8th gym in a final confrontation where the team has gone too far. Their final, desperate plan has reached its climax, and you must take down the team leader in, what else, a battle, and quell the godlike legendary being this team enraged. Or just use your Master Ball before finally getting back to the Pokemon League. With the central plot of the game fully behind us now, the Pokemon League serves as a final wrap-up for our side characters, like your final confrontation with your rival, or Wally in Gen 3, love you buddy, and face the champion before beating the game and returning home. The Pokemon League tends to be divorced from the greater themes the game was playing with in the gang plot, so the best Pokemon games try to make the champion important to the player, so this moment doesn't just feel like a formality. Gen 1 is great in this department. The champion reveal is excellent, but at the very least, any Pokemon game worth its salt should ensure the champion is someone you've spent the game with, so you know who they are and your battle with them will have the appropriate weight. Looking at you, Emerald. The king of this particular story structure, in my opinion, is Gen 5, where the story of the Pokemon team and the Pokemon League are fused right until the end, carrying that anticipation to rising action all the way to the credits. It's great. In short, the Pokemon League is a justification for starting your journey, but it's not what the story's about. The story is about really whatever the Pokemon team is getting up to. Balance of nature and our place in it. The inevitable cycle of life and death, of making peace with that inevitability. A story of gods and the nature of the world. A story about who gets to decide how you live your life. From Gen 7 onward, the Pokemon Company tried to take Pokemon's narrative in new directions, with 7 introducing a protagonist that isn't the point of view character, same with Gen 5 really, and Gen 8 genuinely making the story solely about the Pokemon League, for the first time. There's no side plot to Pokemon Sword and Shield. These games are just about the Pokemon League and put a lot of effort into presenting the Gym Challenge as this explosive sporting event, which I think is probably Sword and Shield's greatest strength as a game. Its focus on your various rivals and their stories and the way that they all revolve around the League is refreshing, if simple, and is a new approach for the series. Or it would be if I wasn't lying to you. Despite Gen 8's insistence that this is a Pokemon game about the kids and their Poké League journeys, extra junk keeps spilling in. The mystery of the darkest day, random tremors, and hints of a conspiracy as you go from gym to gym, some oddness around Chairman Rose, who's definitely not the antagonist. This game does have a side plot cooking on the back burner. But every time these events come up, the adults in the room shut you down. Let the adults handle this, kids. You guys focus on your gym challenge. And I would love to follow their advice. The game clearly put a lot of effort into making the gyms cooler than they've ever been before, but there are still these outside elements dividing your attention. You see, the shenanigans of the local gang or the main antagonists in the prior generations are meant to break up the pace of the game. Don't just chase the Pokemon League, let's do some other stuff in the world. Explore some out-of-the-way dungeons, see the sights, perhaps go back to old roots with your new HMs and collect items you couldn't before, and if you're really lucky, maybe you'll even find a legendary out there. Oh, and of course, stopping the Pokemon team from doing whatever bad thing they're doing, that's a given. But in Sword and Shield, all that optional content is gone, and that side story stuff still exists, but as cutscenes. You see other characters talk about what would be the main plot of any other Pokemon game, and then they insist you don't help out, and push you towards this thing you've been doing the entire game long. There's no hidden paths or routes, no secret dungeons. Sword and Shield is the most linear Pokemon generation that exists, and that wouldn't be an issue if Sword and Shield would stop pretending it's something it's not. I recently replayed Sword to do a challenge run where I only used bugs. I didn't record any of it because I didn't think I was going to talk about Pokemon, but here was my team if you're interested. And I honestly really liked the pop and circumstance of the gym challenge, and using what is traditionally a weaker Pokemon type made things more exciting. Public service announcement: if you don't like a Pokemon game, do a challenge run. That makes it fundamentally more interesting. Anyway, when the game constantly points out how interesting its rival characters in the gym challenge are and constantly downplays its side story, it makes sense that my takeaway during these cutscenes is, why are we here? Why do you keep making me do this if you don't want me to care about it? You can't expect me to care if you've told me not to, and this is a bad energy to bring to this game's Elite Four equivalent, which is interrupted 3 separate times because all that background stuff needs to be resolved. You can feel how they're running out of time with this. In one scene, you finally hear the villain's motivation at the very end of the game, and then he acts on it like an hour later. And I mean an hour time. In game, he waits a full day. Sword and Shield are trying to take Pokemon's story in a new direction, but they're too married to the traditional structure of a Pokemon narrative. It doesn't know what it wants to focus on. It wants to have its cake and eat it too, and we're left with a slog of a story as a result. I wanted to meet Gen 8 where it was at. I wanted to enjoy the sports drama aspect of Sword and Shield that you can tell a lot of effort went into, but it trips over its tail trying to keep to tradition. Not a very good Pokemon game. Soon after, an actually experimental Pokemon game came out in Pokemon Legends Arceus, which a lot of people liked. But it's not mainline, so I'm not talking about it. However, the next mainline game would carry forward a lot of Arceus' design innovations, because Pokemon games are made on assembly line, leading us to Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, the first true open-world Pokemon game. Finally, Pokemon are just walking out and about in the open country, and you can head in whatever direction you please from the start of your adventure, which is cool. But I'm not here to talk about mechanics, am I? How does Pokemon Scarlet and Violet change its narrative to fit its new open world? Pokemon games historically have very linear stories. There are no branching paths, just side content and different plot lines becoming the focus at different moments. In Gen 9, after a hand-holdy and long introduction, not that I'm complaining, these are games for children, you are given 3 different side quests with their areas of interest peppered all over the map. So far, you've only met a couple of characters, but each of them represents or supports a side quest. The battle-drunk rival Nemona is the gym challenge, the prickly sandwich artist Arven is the Titan Pokemon quests, and the mysterious Cassiopeia, who hacks into your phone and requests your assistance with taking down Team Star, a band of bullies causing trouble around school. Other side characters, such as the Academy Chairman, the Pokemon Professor, and Penny, a student you save from Team Star, all add mystery and interest to these various quests. What did the Dean mean about the Pokemon Professor here? What does Arven want with these herbs, and why is he so antagonistic towards my bike lizard dog thing? Why is Penny so cute, and why won't Mr. Bike lick me like that? These mysteries pull you along and reignite your interest in these side quests, because unlike in previous Pokemon games, there's nothing forcing you to continue these quests. I said a while ago that you stop the dastardly deeds of the previous Pokemon teams because it's the right thing to do, but also because the game's a linear story, and if you don't do this, it doesn't continue. There isn't any narrative choice in early Pokemon games, whereas here, you could choose to not continue a plot if you aren't interested. That's why these mystery elements exist in these quests. The Pokemon Company is giving the narratives a light dusting of mystery to keep you engaged as you travel from location to location. With each quest having a full character attached to it, you spend a lot of time with these people, which will hopefully endear you to their quirks and capabilities before you reach the endgame. Yes, and like in every Pokemon game before this, the credits don't roll when you beat the champion. That's just one of the quests. Nemona's quest! And something about the well-executed characters paired with just how much time you spend with them made me really care about each of these lovable dorks before the end, which is a true testament to this game. The character work is top-notch. If it isn't better than Gen 5, it's second place, I swear on that. I must clarify that just because you can pick which events to do in what order, doesn't mean they're optional. I said earlier that you weren't forced to continue a questline, but you will need to complete all of them in order to reach the endgame. Each of these characters are instrumental to your success at the climax, where we explore the backstory of one of this game's central characters, your Lizard Bike. Even though Mr. Bike is basically just a glorified movement mechanic, this time spent together brings you two closer, whether you noticed or not. Arven's quest does give some backstory on Mr. Bike, but even without that, his usefulness alone makes you care about him. Like Agro from Shadow of the Colossus, you'd be nothing without your horse, so a bond is established purely through the mechanical interaction you have with the horse in-game. And also the fact that it's a horse helps. You probably don't like randomly herding friendly animal companions, and Mr. Bike is no different. At the conclusion of Scarlet and Violet, the narrative does an excellent job hammering home this franchise's central tenet. Your strength lies in the bonds you share with others. Whether it's the anime or the mechanics of the games, it's all about the understanding you share with your fellows and the creatures of the world. And this generation isn't explicit about that theme. It's not like, we'll show the big bad the real superpower of teamwork. Nothing like that. You come together with your friends, with your Pokemon, with Mr. Bike, and the strength of your friendships with each of them is able to overcome the final villain, who stands as the opposite of those bonds. So yeah, Scarlet and Violet has excellent characters that may not be as complex as N was, but are super likable. A fully explorable world that takes advantage of its openness to make its story more mysterious and enticing to follow. And honestly, I had so much fun beating this game. I have very nearly finished the Pokédex at time of writing. I just need to meet with a friend and trade the version exclusives, and then I'll basically be done. I'm an adult now, so I have to schedule when I trade Pokemon. Isn't that weird? It's extremely unfortunate that Gen 9 puts its worst foot forward, with its most outrageous graphical hiccups coming right at the beginning. And yes, Switch slow and old, we cannot deny that, but I genuinely haven't had this much fun in a Pokemon game since I was a child. And it was a great story, some cool twists, especially in the end, and it has a ton of heart. I really do recommend it. If you can stomach the jank, this game is a great one. And honestly, if you're still buying Pokemon games, you've learned to stomach that a long time ago. Also, this is purely an aside with no bearing on the video, but the friendship between your character and Nemona is so positive and joyful that it made me really wish for a Pokemon romance story. I know, these two are purely platonic, and this is just my hopeless romantic brain running on overload, but the support Nemona showers on you is like truly love. Definitely platonic love, if nothing more. And I would just be interested to see what people would or could do with romance in the Pokemon world. I think they'd be really neat. Anyway, moving on. For most of my life, the Zelda series has suffered from a bit of an identity problem. The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past was only the third game released in the Zelda series, but it was an amazing title that blew everything before it out of the water, and is to this day a very beloved game. It's a popular tactic with game essayists such as myself to take a popular thing and go, this f***ing sucks actually, but nobody talks smack about Link to the Past. So, that game's formula. Find item in dungeon, use item to beat dungeon before escaping to the overworld where your new toy has a litany of new applications, was used for more than a decade, and for good reason. Using your tools, and sometimes combining effects for traversal or puzzle scenarios makes you feel smart even though it was all engineered by the game's designers. It's simple, elegant, smart. So, they kept doing this, over and over and over and over, each time pushing the envelope of what was possible in this space. But here's an issue. The application of these tools is often very prescriptive. You're locked into a room you found the item in, and you must use it to escape, and then the dungeon teaches you its various use cases. If they thought of multiple uses, that is. The dungeon order is set in stone, which means the order of upgrades and items are set as well. There are side quests to do and supportive upgrades to find, but the big stuff, the dungeons, the new gear, that's all linear. Not a lot of ways to innovate in the structure department, so Zelda innovated by making more impressive dungeons, or in more tertiary areas like overworld traversal or story, which is how we get to Twilight Princess. Twilight Princess is the dark horse of the Zelda franchise. Or perhaps the Dark Wolf. No, please, thank you. Everyone, sit down, everybody. Twilight Princess goes hard on the spectacle, with epic encounters, bombastic music, and the most fleshed out companion character in any Zelda game, though some people would debate me on that. This game was an aggressive course correction from Wind Waker. Remember, that game was poorly received when it came out, So the cartoonish characters, bright palette, and dark storyline was replaced with a realistic art style, a Gen 7 piss yellow-green color palette, and still dark themes. Zelda is consistently dark. Here's the second Jacob Geller recommendation of this video. As you can tell, I'm definitely not a fan. This Zelda is so focused on its moody story that, for a certain kind of hot topic kid born somewhere in this range, this game is everything to you. It's still my favorite Zelda game, thanks to the sense of epicness it brings to its cinematic sequences. Link tearing out to Hyrule Field, engaging the entire Bulbin warband to save Colin after he sacrificed himself to save the other children, jousting King Bulbin across the bridge with the loser damned to a fathomless chasm, and then Link and Epona kicking up in the twilight just to show how badass they are. God, this game rules! None of these things are the actual gameplay. It's the presentation, the charisma, and style that elevates the action of Twilight Princess. But this focus on spectacle betrays something about the game design. If all of this polish is going into presentation and aesthetic, but there's a comparative lack of innovation in the gameplay side, then where can the Zelda series go from here? We know now that Twilight Princess did not go over well in the halls of Nintendo. In fact, Shigeru Miyamoto disliked the game so much that he said in an interview on the now defunct GameCube magazine Cube, stellar name, that Twilight Princess would be, quote, without a doubt, the last Zelda game as you know it in its present form. This mature, gritty, dark Zelda was the turning point, with every game past it abandoning the design popularized by A Link to the Past in an attempt to find a new gameplay identity, while also pushing the story in new directions, some successfully, others less so. For all the good ideas Skyward Sword has, you can tell it was suffering from growing pains, like the reuse of nearly every area multiple times, and also the Zelda timeline, which was an aggressive marketing ploy for this game that nobody should take seriously anymore. After Skyward Sword, Nintendo looked back to their roots, to the design goal of the first Legend of Zelda, a series meant to evoke the excitement of exploring the unknown, the caves, fields, and woods that Miyamoto would explore in his youth. With modern hardware, how could Nintendo produce a miniature world with new discoveries around every corner, just as they did 31 years ago? Their answer was The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild's open world is extremely hands-off compared to the direction Pokemon went. True, Scarlet and Violet allows you to do anything in any order, but you're still required to complete all of these quests eventually. Zelda has developed a taste for spectacular narratives over the years, but with Breath of the Wild, that approach would not work. Breath of the Wild makes player freedom its central design goal, going so far as to allow the player to fight the final boss from the jump, and win if you're especially cracked. While, yes, this does give the player an unprecedented degree of freedom, it also has a devastating effect on the story's narrative. For this moment to land, literally nothing past what Rome tells you in tutorial must be crucial to your understanding of the game. This is the problem of Wild's narrative, and the number one task of the narrative designers for this game. How do you create hours upon hours of narrative that is both engaging for the player and remembered for years to come, and, to put it harshly, is completely incidental to the conclusion of the story? How do you produce an ending that feels complete for both a 5-hour playthrough and a 300-hour playthrough? The narrative design of Breath of the Wild goes about this goal in 3 key ways. For one, amnesia. Link does not remember any of the events of the story, so if you really do decide to beat the game from the start, this moment with Zelda still makes sense. In fact, it's kind of even better, because the answer to her question in this case is a definitive no! No, you do not! Serving as a slight punishment for your punctuality. Even as you beaten the game, you didn't really experience it as the developers would have wanted. Good job, hero! But, you skipped over our cutscenes. We worked hard on those. The second aspect of the narrative design is the separation of the timeline. Not this one, but this one. Nearly every cinematic cutscene in this game takes the form of a memory, going back to the era of the champions, detailing Link's journey with Zelda as she initially avoids him, grows to respect his strength, researches the Guardians, tries to unlock her power, and ultimately fails when it matters most. While all of this stuff in the past is crucial context for the modern day, those events passed more than a century ago, and only the Zora and the Sheikah are long-lived enough to remember those days. To everyone else, it's a story many generations old, and the characters of that story have entered the realm of myths and monsters. Another important detail is that the past timeline's main character isn't Link, but Zelda. Link's agency isn't the one that matters in the past. Zelda was making all the decisions, and it is through her journey that she can grow strong enough to hold back the darkness for 100 years and give Link another chance to defeat Calamity Ganon. When Link remembers an old memory, it's sometimes about the now deceased champions, but mostly it's Zelda. And while the story of Zelda, the legend of Zelda if you will, is emotional, introspective, brimming with personality, and certainly makes her one of the more fleshed out Zeldas, this is all character work for a person we don't get to see until the very end of the game, where she says that final line. And that's where these two moments click. All your memories are about Zelda and her journey, and now she's asking you, do you really remember her? These previous 2 points fold really well into my favorite aspect of Breath of the Wild, its mood. Hyrule is a land that has seen much devastation, and through the sacrificing of all its heroes, Zelda managed to save her kingdom at the very last moment. And even though, yes, she saved countless lives, from the perspective of those survivors, that kingdom is gone. No princess, no king, no champions. The kingdom of Hyrule really did end that day. But the people didn't, and the land healed. And Link reawakens 100 years later, blah, 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 blah. I've already made a video talking about this. But what all of this evokes is a very pensive mood for a very melancholic game. The music is broken, disjointed, but beautiful in its way, a parallel to Hyrule's current state. Each memory Link collects, whether those memories are happy, sad, troubled, or frantic, they are each filtered through a century of loss, nostalgia pulling the color from the scene, leaving a twinge of sadness in every moment. Regardless of their original emotion, you're left with the same feeling. They're all gone now. To remember these memories, you are encouraged to walk through the environment, really take in your surroundings, and understand the land you hope to save. Sometimes Link looks over the environment and we see the landscape Zelda had hoped to preserve, what they were fighting for, thankfully still here. But sometimes, these landscapes show how things have changed, sometimes corrupted, but sometimes adapted to the new normal. There's beauty in change, even if it hurts. Which is all to say that even if all of this stuff is unnecessary to the conclusion, all detail and context which is designed to be passed over if you don't care, it contributes to the mood of the game. The sorrow of loss, the contemplativeness of the whole experience, and in rare moments, the feeling of growth. How that terrible blow may have ended your world, but it was also the start of a new one. When I finished the final memory, framing one of the final guardians which spelled the end for Link, I came out of that memory with the sun illuminating the area. The ground is pocked from explosions, the scars of battle and the ruins of those monsters that did it dot the landscape, but the birds are chirping. The grass grew back, and the sun still rose that following day, just as it is right now. All of these moments reinforce that original melancholic loss Rome gestures at in the tutorial, and the final fight transforms that feeling into triumph, beating the darkness despite impossible odds, despite the sacrifice of everyone who came before you, or perhaps because of it, and finally being asked by someone who used to mean a lot to you if you actually took the time to immerse yourself in that loss. Have you really come to terms with time's passage? It is only through understanding the past and reconciling with Hyrule's present that you and Zelda can plan for Hyrule's future, with the ancestors of the people she saved a century ago, and you saved today. It is that exact sentiment, building a better future, that ends up being the guiding principle for Tears of the Kingdom. Camaraderie, teamwork, rebuilding what was once lost. It's a great theme that expands upon Breath of the Wild's foundation and leads to yet another epic tale in the Legend of Zelda tapestry. But there's a real problem with Tears' narrative design. Tears of the Kingdom is built on top of Breath of the Wild's world and mechanics so heavily that a lot of wild stuff is just here, in Tears of the Kingdom, regardless of if it makes sense for this new story or gameplay identity. There are plenty of videos out there that detail Tears of the Kingdom's story and how, despite its flash and excitement, it doesn't really hold water compared to the Breath of the Wild. And that has everything to do with Tears trying to retrofit Breath of the Wild's narrative design for its own goals. The memories in Tears outline a more traditional narrative, rising action, climax, moments of calm and excitement, and experiencing those out of order can make the story messy. Memories that reference other memories, flashbacks to events you literally may not know about yet. This particularly egregious example, where one memory leads directly into the next one. It's a typical linear story construction, but key moments lose their narrative impact because you likely didn't see them in order. I understand that Tears of the Kingdom's memories are meant to be constructed like a mystery, but that's not the story they made. In one of the final memories, Zelda has a flashback to some moment with the goat wizards before exclaiming that she knows what to do. If we received just a slide of this conversation, then flashed back, then I get it. Mystery elements enticing our interest. What did Goat Wizard say to her there? But instead, they give you all of the pertinent information. No mystery here. This moment, along with the two memories that directly follow each other, leads me to believe that the story they wanted to tell wasn't made for this narrative design. Rather, it was forced to fit into Breath of the Wild's memory collection gameplay because, hey, it worked well last time and it's what we have on hand. But these memories weren't designed for that story structure, leading to some odd writing choices. moments where the story must hold your hand because you may not have seen the pertinent information, or small hiccups to the pacing because memories can only be so long. Rather than trying to scan your environment for moments of importance to you in Zelda, new memory locations are large geoglyphs that demand your attention by glowing. The metaphorical significance of finding a place that was important to you in Zelda is replaced with what is essentially a traversal minigame. Find the tier in the geoglyph. Use your vehicles to get around easier. Yes, this does lean into the building metaphor of the game, but I don't know, it just doesn't feel as narratively satisfying as Breath of the Wild's narrative metaphor for its memories. It lacks the sauce. Like Breath of the Wild, the memories and entire game are still skippable, meaning the ending of the game should still make sense and follow from the themes and cutscenes shown during the tutorial, but that is definitely not the case. The memories are important to understanding the game's conclusion, and some of them recontextualize your primary goal as you play through the game. The tiers are crucial plot, so why can I skip them? Tiers has its feet in two camps. The memories are important to understanding the story, but it also doesn't want to write the story to react to you possessing that information. The main goal of the game is to find Zelda, and the new champions are each dealing with an almost ghost-like Zelda that has entered their domain and started causing problems. After completing the memories, you know where Zelda is, and you have an idea of what's up with that weird antagonistic Zelda, which will be made more explicit later, but Link will never tell anyone this information. This is because the open-world Zelda duology is invested in player freedom above all else. Link lets all of his friends and the Sheikah fret over the missing princess even after learning the truth because, mechanically speaking, Link doesn't know where Zelda is. You can do any quest in any order, meaning all of these quests could be your first quest. Put another way, almost every quest in the game is written from the assumed position that Link doesn't know where Zelda is. Having the game respond when you clear the memories means Link could just explain the situation to those around him and trivialize the game's story. And they don't want that to happen. Nintendo wants the players to be able to do everything in the game, no matter how far in the story they are. Player freedom above all else, remember? By trying to strap this traditional story structure onto a game that was designed to be played in any order the player chooses, Link can seem either callous or stupid. The current day cutscenes are formulaic and cookie cutter because they all could have been your first one, so they must all show the same information. And the original mood of Breath of the Wild is replaced with a hodgepodge of emotions and styles that don't cohere into a singular whole. The mood of Tears of the Kingdom returns to the epic narratives of old Zelda, and sure, it achieves that goal. The game is full of action and bombast, but the story doesn't make as much sense in this narrative design, so it loses some of its impact. People still remember the first time they played Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom feels like we're squeezing more blood from the stone, both mechanically and narratively. Not unlike Sword and Shield, Tears of the Kingdom is a mismatch of narrative design. The story they've written is great. I genuinely love the ending of Tears of the Kingdom, but it wasn't made to fit into this game's structure. When we try to make a story fit a game it doesn't belong to, it can make a great story muddy or fail to translate to the player. And for a game with as much heart as Tears shows in its best moments, that's heartbreaking. But that is not the end of Zelda's story. The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom is a fusion of the more open and exploratory sensibilities of the new Zelda with the world and dungeon design of the old. And time will tell if it manages to fuse these two styles into something fresh and new. Shigeru Miyamoto said it in 2007, and Eiji Onuma, one of the top producers of the Zelda franchise, continues to ring that bell to this day. We are not going back to the Link to the past. Perhaps Echoes of Wisdom can link that past with the current direction Nintendo is interested in taking, and bring fans new and old together to appreciate this puzzly adventure game where Zelda is the hero for the first time ever. Only time will tell. But if you find yourself intrigued by the promise of a puzzle platformer where the world is a tool to exploit, almost like a Hitman game, I recommend you give it a try. I'm not going to discuss Wisdom's narrative design in this video, both because the game just came out and I don't want to ruin it for anyone, and because I haven't played it yet. But I encourage you to try it. This could be the new direction Zelda takes from this point forward. But looking over the past 15 years, it seems Nintendo is done taking any one direction with Zelda. They learned from their time with the Link to the Past and the games that followed. Never again will they stick to any one design formula. To change is human. To change is Zelda. And that's kind of the video, but to be honest, I haven't even scratched the surface of narrative design. Every game is a different beast, and each one goes about marrying its gameplay and narrative in different ways, and there's no such thing as a perfect solution that fits every game, or even two games. That's kind of my point with Tears of the Kingdom. And literally everything can have an effect. Controls are a great example of this. You think a game like Before Your Eyes would even remotely work outside of the VR environment? Sure, you can experience it in a Let's Play or something, but seeing the twists and turns before your eyes is sure to have the greatest impact, and that's unfortunately only possible in VR. Or, to spin it, it is possible because of VR, and that's what makes it amazing. Even games that are seemingly story agnostic can still communicate a lot through narrative design. I know that I used Tetris earlier as an example of a gameplay-heavy, no-story kind of game, but that's not entirely true. If you give me like a minute, I'll show you what I mean. Tetris Effect is a game that turns the traditional Tetris gameplay that you know and love into a light show that dazzles and puts your graphics card through its paces. But these backgrounds are telling a story. Everybody knows about Tetris. It's either number 1 or number 2 in the world for copies sold, depending on how you count. So regardless of who you are or where you come from, odds are we can all connect through Tetris. And the music, sounds, and lights tell us this. Music from all across the world is featured, experiences that most people in the world understand, like a fireworks festival, then moments of connection, where pilgrims traveling across the desert are compared to a lone rover on our moon. No matter how far apart we all share in the same experience. Even down to the name of the very first song, Connected. Tetris Effect tells a story of humanity, the disparate ways that we are all alike and different, and how we are all connected through this shared experience. And Tetris. We all play Tetris. In summation, narrative design is everywhere. It's the thing that makes games special, that blend of interactivity and storytelling that no other medium quite has like games. When you next play your favorite game, consider what it is about the gameplay that makes the story special. Not just how much that story moves you, but how the controls, the mechanics, the interactivity make that story stronger when you experience it through the gameplay. That's essentially what this entire channel has been about so far, and I encourage you to consider it for yourself. What are your favorite games that do this well? Any particular standout that you'd like me to see? Do you think my opinions are stupid and you'd like to really give me a piece of your mind? If so, make sure to leave a comment and consider subscribing and Patreon-ing, because every sub and dollar helps me continue to pursue this work and not have to go back to pencil pushing. It truly does help, and I hope you consider joining these wonderful folks. With all that being said, I am Super Dude. Thank you for watching.